In a standard Vue CLI 3 installation, the source files are found here in this folder source. But the assumption made by Vue CLI 3 is that the code base is just for a client app. But since we're building a full stack app and we have our server folder here, it'd make more sense to have the client app code in a folder called client, I think. So we can rename that directory by simply moving it. Changing that directory name is going to cause some issues though. Vue CLI 3 service expects that the client files will be in a directory called source, not client. So if we try to run the npm run serve command, you'll see that we get an error. To fix this, we're going to have to override some of the default Vue CLI 3 Webpack configuration. So how do we know exactly which Webpack configuration has the source folder name hard-coded? Well, we can find out by inspecting the Webpack configuration using the Vue inspect command. Now you'll see that the output is quite long and it's going to be difficult to read that from the terminal. So what we should do instead is output that to a file. We'll call it webpack.txt. So if we now open that file, we can do a search for source, src. And you'll see that we have two instances of that. The first one is here in the alias section, and we'll come back to that. The first one I want to deal with is down here in the entry section. To override webpack config, we'll need to create a vue.config.js file. We can then use webpack chain to provide declarative config overrides. So let's begin by creating that config file. As this file is a node module, we'll firstly have to export our config object. Now we can add a chain webpack property to the config, and we'll assign a function to this where config is going to be the argument. So config is a webpack chain object that contains all of the existing webpack config. To change the app entry, we use the config object and we call the entry method first and pass the argument app. Now we can call the clear method, and that's going to clear any pre-existing rules. We can now use add to add a new entry, and we'll use the string /client/main.js to point to our main.js file in the client directory. So with that done, we can now call end, and hopefully that will work. So let's now inspect our webpack file again. Now, if we go to the bottom of the config and look at the entry rule, you can see that that's been updated and no longer mentions the source folder. If we now try to run npm run serve again, you'll see that we're met with a new problem. This time we get a report of a missing dependency at components hello world.vue. Now the reason for that is that at is a webpack alias that points to the source folder by default. You can see that if we inspect our webpack config again and look for the other instance of source. So there it is in that line there. Now you'll notice that the path in this alias is a full file system path. So to make a full path in our config, we can use the node path module, which we'll require at the top of this file. Let's now update our alias in the config by making another call to the config object, and this time we'll reference resolve.alias like that. And then we're going to call the set method, and the first argument will be at like that. Now what we want to do is use path, and we'll use the join method. And so the first argument to that will be __ name, which is a Node.js global that references the absolute path to the root directory. And then the second argument will be /client like that. So that's going to create a full path to the client folder. With that done, let's kill the server and again output our webpack config to the text file. Taking a look again, we can now see in the alias section that alias has been updated and now references the client folder instead of source, so that's good. So if we try to run our server again, you'll see now that it's working as it should. Now, something to keep in mind is that if you do add any more plugins to this project, you may need to repeat this process again, as Vue plugins will always assume the directory that you're going to use is source. Alright, so let's kill the server, and before we finish the video, I want to remove that webpack.txt file because we're not going to need that in our repo any longer.